Welcome, everyone. So incredibly delighted that you've chosen to be here with us. We have the incredible Marianne Williamson, a person who really needs no introduction, but I actually want to start by simply saying, Marianne, you have been such an inspiration to me over the years. Your teachings have had such a profound impact on my life. And what I appreciate about you right now is you're bringing consciousness and spirituality into the world in a very, very profound way. So welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely delighted. So, our title today, our conversation today is A New Path Forward. And I wanted to start by asking if you could share a little bit about how you have been using your decades of experience with consciousness and spirituality and how you're now such a powerful way, one of the, I think, the preeminent voices of bringing spirituality into the world in a really new way. So I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about how you're doing that and how that's going for you.
Well, to me, all that spirituality means is the path of the heart.
Yeah.
And there's nothing new to that at all. And there's nothing new to it in terms of most people's everyday life experience. I think the vast majority of people in this country and in the world try to live lives that are guided by love, however we understand that concept. I think people try to be ethical. They try to be honest. They try to be honorable in their own way and live by a set of morals. I think the vast majority of people do try to live decent lives. So I don't have anything to say about that. That I believe is that new. I talk about things that are ancient and universal spiritual principles. What I do believe is an urgently needed conversation, and that I have been holding within the larger culture, is that those same principles of ethics and honor and compassion and honesty need to guide our collective experiences as well. And our collective experience is called politics. It's not enough that I try to be good or that you try to be good. At a certain point, public policy has to be good. It's not enough that you or I wouldn't neglect a hungry child. Public policy has to not neglect a hungry child. It's not enough that you or I would try to be good to the earth, to the environment. Public policy has to be good to the earth, to the environment. It's not enough that you or I would have tried to protect ourselves from the ravages of this coronavirus. It's that public policy was such that we were not collectively protected. And this goes on and on economic issues, social issues, political issues, that the zeitgeist of this moment is the realization that I don't care what the public issue is, it will get to your private door, and that we must apply the same psychological and emotional and spiritual and moral principles to the larger conversation about the culture that we already do, I think, in our lives, most of us individually.
Well, I love that. And thank you for that, because what I hear you saying is that that's innate within each of us, right? We all want to come from a place of love and we all want to connect. So then I think the natural question, and what a lot of people have been asking me, is what you already spoke to, which is, okay, so we know how to do that, many of us in our individual lives. How do we now start to make a difference in the world? As you're saying, like, one of the reasons that I wholeheartedly endorsed you for president is the Department of Peace, your focus on children and on well-being. So it's one thing to identify what's wrong in the system, and we could spend hours talking about that. And I know you and I are painfully aware of the issues there. How do we shift? How do we make a difference and take it from the individual experience into how we actually bring it into the world in a new way?
We heal in life, one aha at a moment at a time. We just have an aha. And when you have used the word shift, but it's not really a shift. It's a constant tweaking to the realization that it's the exact same principles we've already been talking about, but you apply them to public policy as well. What is the loving thing to do? We don't have to shift into that question. We're already asking that question. The issue is to take the same principles we already deal with in our lives and to ask, well, is that the right? Is that treating people right? Now, I grew up in an America where there were two major political viewpoints, conservative and liberal. And there are high-minded conservative principles and high-minded liberal principles. They were both built on a foundation of concern for people But the difference was in people saying, how is the best way to serve? Right. And Eisenhower said that the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. But what has happened in the last 40 years is something that is neither conservative nor liberal, but it is sociopathic. Now, I want to say sociopathic here because the higher consciousness community, everybody's read books like Sociopath Next Door. A sociopath is someone who has no empathy. A sociopath is someone who has no feeling for other people. A sociopath is someone who has no sense of moral or ethical responsibility to others. And, the conversation in our culture for quite a while now has been sociopaths are everywhere. Well, what's happening now is that we have an economic system which is essentially sociopathic. It's like a head that is disconnected from the heart. It is this huge economic juggernaut that is based on this idea that all responsibility is financial responsibility to stockholders that does not include, it is completely untethered to any sense of ethical or moral responsibility to people, to planet, or to animals. This is not conservative and it's not liberal. It is sociopathic. It is amoral. But being amoral, it leads to immoral consequences. It's not that you have leaders of big companies and they wake up in the morning and they think, how can I hurt the environment? They don't wake up in the morning and think, how can I hurt children? But they do wake up in the morning and believe that it's not their responsibility to concern themselves with those things one way or the other. Now, that of itself wouldn't be that horrible if government took care of those things. Mm-hmm. But government now has been so influenced by the undue financial power of those same forces that we have an entire economic and political system now that is completely disconnected from any alignment with the tender mercies of what it means to be human. And this is dangerous. This is dangerous.
Yeah, and I'm really, really energized at this moment because I actually have used that same framework multiple times. I have the honor of working in the mental health field, and I at one point woke up and thought, collectively, the collective consciousness that is America could receive so many diagnoses, like, really a lot of different diagnoses, including sociopathic. And so how is it that the collective isn't in alignment with the individual? And I love what you're saying because there is there's something that has happened in our culture over time where, as you said, the companies and their relationship with the politics was different than it is now. And I think there is a huge conversation that can be had about that. A huge conversation that can be had about how we can start to shift that. And I know I keep using the word shift. I know that it's already innate within us, but how do we bring that into the world? And that's why I love our title, A New Path Forward.
The older you are, the more you know certain things. And the younger you are, the more you know certain other things. Mm. The younger you are, the more you know what's happening now. But the older you are, the more you know how things fit into things that happened before. I'm old enough that I remember a time, and now this is not to romanticize or glamorize American capitalism before the 1980s, but I can tell you there was a time in my lifetime when the U.S. corporation was expected to care. If somebody had worked, for a company for decades, the general social consensus was that that corporation owed them a dignified retirement. There was a terrible split that occurred in the 1980s when trickle economic theory was proffered as this marvelous new guiding principle for American society. And the idea was that if we made it as easy as possible for a stockholder class to make money, then they would create jobs and all that would trickle down and lift all boats. Well, after 40 years, we can see it didn't lift all boats. It has created the largest income inequality since 1929 because it has taken all the money and put it in the hands of a small group of people. Then over the ensuing 2 decades, the issue of money in politics became so great, and the Supreme Court kept giving more opportunity to these companies to basically create what's almost like it's not even almost, it is a system of legalized bribery. So that our government now does more to advocate for a small group of people to make money than for the health and well-being of the larger collective. And what this has done is left tens of millions of people without health care, tens of millions of people without food, tens of millions of people burdened by these college loans. It's not a way to run a society. It's not a way to run a democracy, because too many people are outside the matrix of opportunity to really economically and in every other way spread their wings. Now, how did this happen? Billions of dollars were put behind it. And I want to point out something that's interesting. There was a man named Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman, back in the 1980s, it was at the University of Chicago, and he was the main articulator of this free market trickle-down theory. But I think it's worth noting that even Milton Friedman said, it's only safe, though, if we have a universal basic income. He recognized that you can't play cowboy like that. You can't do this unless people are safe enough to be able to get in the game. And then also another person in history that we should remember was Adam Smith. And Adam Smith was the main articulator of free market capitalism. And Adam Smith said free market capitalism will not work outside an ethical context. So if I should have a conscience, and you should have a conscience, public policy should have a conscience. And what do you call someone who has no conscience? A sociopath. Now, you were talking about mental health. Everybody says people have mental health issues. When you have tens of millions of people, as we've had in the United States, even before COVID, who live with chronic economic tension and anxiety. Yeah. Chronically, daily, they do not know what would happen if they got sick. They do not know what would happen if their children got sick. They don't know how they're going to send their kids to college. They don't know how they're going to get out from under these college loans. They live with this chronic tension and anxiety, and it's showing up in all kinds of addictive behavior, and it's showing up in all kinds of depression, and it's showing up in all kinds of drug use, etc. And then we say they have a mental health issue. No. They are living within a system that is so redolent with despair factors. So then we just put it on them. And interestingly enough, one of the same industries that's part of that matrix of socioeconomic sociopathology, namely big pharmaceutical companies, health insurance companies, gun manufacturers, food companies, agribusiness, defense contractors get to say, well, you have this mental health issue and perhaps we could help you. No, you could help us by getting out of the way so that people have a chance to thrive. And then it's amazing how much less mental health issue we would have when people are not living in such chronic despair.
Yes, and one of the things why I am feeling so aligned with you, Marianne, at this time, really always, but especially at this time, is in my work, I address the exact same issues, that we're looking only at the symptoms rather than getting down at the root causes. And then we're treating the symptoms, and we're treating what we call a mental health issue with pharmaceuticals, which is only numbing out the symptom. It's not getting down to the root causes. And we're not speaking against them.
I want to be careful here, because I know how that can work. This is not to say that there's never a legitimate use for psychotherapeutic drugs at all. There are such things as schizophrenia. There are such things as bipolar, etc. However, I think what you and I are arguing is that there is also a purview of normal human despair that is not a mental illness, and that normal human despair needs to be addressed. It's a spiritual issue. It used to be called the dark night of the soul.
Absolutely. And I love that, because yes, to be clear, we're not against that. What we're saying is that in addition to looking at the symptoms, we also want to get down to the deeper root causes. And when I heard you interviewed some time back, you were talking about the political system that most politicians, including everyone that was on that stage with you, quite frankly, was talking about the issues and the symptoms in our country, and you were bringing a different conversation. What's at the heart of this? What's at the soul of this? How do we start to heal this? So as you said, the symptoms then don't show up in the same way they are now.
It's allopathic medicine. It's just trying to suppress or eradicate the symptom rather than dealing with the cause. But let's talk about why the political system doesn't deal with the cause. So one major political party has been completely bought, hook, line, and sinker. It's not what it was when I was growing up, and it's whatever this matrix of multinational corporate power wants, right, to increase its own short-term profits. The other major political party does show more desire to treat the symptom. It does show more. And by the way, the first party that I mentioned, they don't even care about the symptom at this point.
Right.
The other one wants to treat the symptom and ameliorate the effects. But it too, because it too is infused with so much of the corporate money, refuses to challenge the underlying forces that make all that pain inevitable. And that's why it's a political revolution that is necessary in order for us to address these things the way they need to be addressed.
And that is a perfect segue into what I want to talk about next, because those of us who are in spiritual circles, and I'm going to really, this is an invitation to everyone that's watching this, whether you're watching live or as we re-show this, I have seen people in the spiritual world kind of turning away from politics. And I think that has been something that has been deeply ingrained in our spiritual communities now for decades. I've been in New Thought for 30 years, and there's been this tendency to work only in consciousness. And obviously that is important, but how do we as spiritual people invite each other to engage in this so that we can bring this revolution, this spiritual revolution into the conversation of politics?
By recognizing what bullshit it is. There is no religious or spiritual tradition anywhere that gives anyone a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. When you're having a conversation that you call spiritual and you are conveniently leaving out the conversation about the suffering of other sentient beings, use whatever word you want, but let's not call it spiritual. Yeah. Because spiritual is about loving each other. And if a starving man is standing in front of me and I say, I love you, but I don't give him a piece of bread, that's called hypocrisy and all the stuff in the Bible when God says, I never knew you. It's very convenient for people who want to sell things. It's very convenient for churches who are concerned that if they say anything slightly controversial, that somebody won't put money in the collection plate. Yeah. I'm a Jewish person, and the Jews, like African Americans, you know, when there's enough persecution in somebody's past, the idea that politics doesn't matter makes no sense whatsoever. Absolutely. So Jews don't fall for that. Black people don't fall for that. Yeah. It's an unfortunate, you know, when I started my career, and at that time it was Deepak Chopra, James Redfield, Neil Donald Walsh came around soon, Gary Zukav. When my career first started, the AIDS crisis burst onto the scene. And so for me, as a Course in Miracles speaker and writer, it was never separated from addressing the suffering of this profound, this population in such crisis. And then I went off to Michigan for a while, and I came back, and it had become this white bread, manicured, neo-capitalist, we can all make money doing this too. And it's not good. And I think a lot of people are awakening from it.
Absolutely. And one of the things I also wanted to speak to is that I think that there has been such a strong focus on being against, right? And so, for example, we often hear people say half of America supported our president, but only 26% of voters voted for our president. So rather than being against him and against those policies, what can we stand for? And I'm really curious, Marianne, where you stand with that. And first of all, thank you. Thank you for your work in the 80s and the early 90s with people suffering from AIDS, because you were a profound spokesperson for love in the midst of that, and acceptance and openness. And as a gay man, I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. So how do we do that now? How do we stand for love? How do we really, because I see even the people that are calling themselves light workers posting what they're against instead of, yes, we acknowledge that, but then how do we pivot into making a difference and engaging people and really lighting a fire, igniting this passion that I know lives within each of us to actually make a difference in our country and in the world?
Jesus did kick over the table of the money changers. So we don't have to be so precious about all that. There is a crucifixion that precedes the resurrection. There was the slavery in Egypt. Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites before they took their journey to the Promised Land. In A Course in Miracles, it says, look at the crucifixion, but do not dwell on it. So some of this, we don't want to be against anything, is kind of immature at a certain point, because there's a difference between transcendence and denial. If you, God forbid, your child is diagnosed with a terrible illness, and the doctor tells you it's leukemia or it's cancer, you don't say, oh, I don't want to talk about it because it's negative. You know, all this, well, if we look at it, it expands. Some things expand because you don't look at them. And there's nothing negative about yelling fire if, in fact, the house is burning down. So I think we all need to be a lot more mature about this. If someone that you love gets ill, you don't say, oh, I can't talk about it because it's negative. This is just this immature developmental level that people got stuck at in an interesting way, because it's a community that is actually very sophisticated, more sophisticated than most, about interpersonal darknesses.
Right.
You know, so I don't get where when it comes to the world, we get all squiggly when we're not that way when it comes to the games that people play on a personal level. That's why I think that people in a higher consciousness community are the last people who should be standing on the sidelines. We should be in there. We should be the biggest grown-ups in the room. And what happened, you know, I like you were pointing out so correctly, we now have a government that is run by a minority consciousness. It's not only the minority in the larger sense that voted for this man, but it's not the consciousness of the American people. If you look at issue after issue, the American people are a little bit left of center.
Yes.
We're a little bit left of center. You know, it's central, but it's a little leftist, actually. Yeah. The vast majority of people want universal health care. The vast majority of people want us to take care of the environment. The vast majority of people want us to educate our children. We're decent people. But what happened is people who are run by fear and greed and even hatred have become very politicized and very convicted. And, you know, in the Course in Miracles, it says conviction is a force multiplier. Too many people who love when it's convenient. And too many people who love from a so-called spiritual perspective have done this, look, I'm not into politics thing. You know, they used to say when I was growing up, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So it's not like the numbers are with the loving, not with the hating. But
exactly.
Those of us who love have to love with as much conviction as is displayed by those of us who hate. And if you won't apply it in politics, then you're saying, I'm willing to love in my own personal life, but I'm not going to worry about the love on the other side of town. I'll worry about my child, but I won't worry about the mothers and their children on the other side of town or the other side of the world. I'll worry about my home, but I won't worry about our collective home, which is the earth itself. And that's not the love that will save the world.
So is everyone hearing that? I want everyone to pause for a moment and really listen to what Marianne just said. If we can love with the same energy that there are people now in the world that are focusing on hate and division, can we shift into being the conduit for love on this planet? Now, Marianne had some pushback talking about love in politics, but that's actually the only way anything ever changes. Can we energize that? Can we bring that into our daily life? And as Marianne said, not just mine personally, because I agree completely. Many of us have gone to workshop after workshop to do our shadow work. It is now time for us to do shadow work in America. All that means is we need to acknowledge what's happening. We need to stop doing the spiritual bypass. We need to look at it, but not live there. You know, Marianne, our common friend Michael Beckwith spoke about it the last time we were on a call so powerfully. You have to acknowledge it, and then you have to know how to work with it. too long, we've been pretending like it's not happening, and that has not gotten us anywhere.
And it's so interesting, too, because like you said, that same community does the shadow work in terms of personal relationships. We're the community that says don't do a spiritual bypass. Well, why should America be doing a spiritual bypass? America has shadows that it has to look at. What do you call racism? What do you call bigotry? What do you call homophobia? What do you call anti-Semitism? These are America's shadows, and they need to be looked at. All that a nation is a group of people. So the same psychological and emotional and spiritual principles that prevail within the journey of an individual prevail within the journey of a nation. And we have to apply the same principles in order to heal the nation.
That's right. And in my own shadow work, it was painful for a while, right? It wasn't all just love and light. It was like, I need to really look at what's trapped in my unconscious. I need to bring that up to conscious awareness for healing. I was doubled over in the fetal position crying, and we need to do that as a country, not because, as Marianne said, talking about this isn't negative, but how we're talking about it and how we start to pivot into what we do with it, but we can't ignore the problem. I want to talk with you about something that I don't hear you talking about a lot, but it's something that honestly, it brings tears to my eyes because you're one of the first people talking about it. And that is the Department of Peace. Because what I think one of the shadows is the billions and billions and billions of dollars that we spend on defending the wall. But you're talking about a Department of Peace. And I wonder if you could share with our viewers a little bit more about that.
General Dwight Eisenhower was the head of all Allied forces during World War II. And then at the end of the war, in 1952, he became president of the United States. He was a Republican president from 1952 to 1960. And then, of course, he was followed by John F. Kennedy. In General Eisenhower's farewell address, now follow me here. At the beginning of World War II, we did not have a standing army, and we had to get one together quick. At the end of World War II, no one would argue we didn't need a standing army. But General Eisenhower, who was then President Eisenhower, in his farewell address, warned us of what he called the military-industrial complex. And he, who the last person was naive about the military needs of the United States, but he said, when there's this much money to be made off weapons of war, the American people are going to have to remain vigilant and watch what's going on here. Yeah. And he was absolutely right. So you can look at the military as allopathic medicine, okay? And you need it. You absolutely need it. However, we now have grown. We have evolved in our understanding of healing the physical body enough to know that you have to take care of your nutrition. You have to take care of exercise. You have to work on keeping your body healthy, because sickness is the absence of health. Health isn't the absence of sickness. So when it comes to war and peace, we don't cultivate peace. The factors that act, there are 4 factors which, when present, statistically indicate there will be a higher incidence of peace and a lower incidence of conflict. And that has to do with greater economic opportunities for women, greater educational opportunities for children, a reduction of violence against women, and a general amelioration of unnecessary human despair. Whether you're talking about a corner of the United States or another corner of the world, those 4 factors, you have those 4 factors, you are much less likely to have conflict. But there's no short-term corporate profit to be made doing those things, whereas there's billions and billions and billions of dollars in short-term corporate profit to be made in fighting the wars and in dealing with the conflicts once they arise. You can't just fight illness, you have to cultivate health. And you can't just fight conflict, you have to cultivate peace. So right now, for instance, we have about a $760 billion military budget, but we have a $40 billion State Department budget. Right. And the USAID inside that, which is strictly for humanitarian aid, is about 17 billion. There's a wonderful book by Ronan Farrow called War on Peace, which talks about how over the last few decades, the kinds of things in American public policy, foreign policy, that used to mainly be headed by diplomats and the State Department is now headed too often by the military. So we have such a militarization of foreign policy. And that's why when I was running for president, I said we need a Department of Peace.
Amen. Now, you are a person that has talked about healing the soul of America. And one of the ways that I know you talk about healing the soul of America is focusing on our children. Because we know, of course, that they are the present of America, but also the future of America and the future of our world. How do we cultivate compassion and love and education and allowing our children to thrive so that the next generation, because I love the next generation, they are impassioned about the economy. They're impassioned about the environment, and they want to make a difference. You know, the younger generation really wants to do something in the world. So how do we care for our children, and how is that part of healing the soul of America?
Well, of course, every generation loves its children. That's not the problem. The problem is not that the average American doesn't love their children. The problem is that our public policy does not display compassion for America's children. And in a way, by the way, that I don't think most people even realize. We have, in the richest country in the world, we have 13 million children. And this was all even before COVID. 13 million children were going to school hungry in the United States. Plus, we have millions of American children going to school in classrooms, that I think we mentioned this before, who don't even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation is drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. We have so many millions of chronically traumatized children in the United States that we actually have a very common thing in American public schools, which is called trauma rooms. Yeah. Now, we have elementary school children in the United States in public schools on suicide watch. Now, this is where the corruption of our politics comes in. Children are not old enough to vote, so they're no constituency. Children are not old enough to work, so they don't have any financial leverage. So the political establishment totally gets away with just giving them lip service, how much they love the children. You know what, they love the children, and they kiss babies on their tours, etc. But they are not a serious political influence in Washington because there's no short-term corporate profit that they represent or leverage, economic leverage. So what I wanted was a United States Department of Children and Youth. I wanted to bring together the early childhood experts, the neuroscientists. We know things about the brain of a child under the age of 10 now that are amazing in terms of neuroplasticity, et cetera. When we don't help these children by the age of 8, we lose them. And where do you think these kids are going to be in 20 years? Right now already, in the country that has more mass incarceration, imprisons more of our people than any country in the world, we have this vast majority of the people who are incarcerated in the United States had abusive childhoods, even violently abused. Where do you think these kids are going to be? So, and economically, you want to have an amazing economy 10 years from now, take better care of your 10-year-olds today. Absolutely. But I also think it's important for us to realize that in this area of children, as in the area of peacemaking, as in the area of the environment, as in the area of everything that we have a problem with in the United States, we have the people who know what to do. You meet these people doing extraordinarily heroic work throughout this country. What's the problem? The problem is that our government does more to fund and to advocate for the problem creators than to fund and advocate for the problem solvers. And once American people wake up to this, perhaps we'll change it.
Thank you. I want to take a couple of questions from the people that are watching right now. The first one is, what do we as spiritual and conscious people, what are some tangible steps that we can do to make a difference in the world? And that's from someone that's watching right now. What can we do as spiritual and conscious people to do in the world? What are some first steps?
Support progressive candidates who are running throughout this country in down ballot races and also federal level, state level, and local level. We're going to have elections in November, and we need a huge fundamental pattern disruption.
Yeah. So let's do it, everyone. Did you hear that? There are tangible steps. We can, as spiritual and conscious people, go out into the world and make a difference. A great spiritual master told us 2,000 years ago, be in the world, but not of the world. So we don't need to get bogged down by it. But as Marianne so beautifully said, we acknowledge what's happening. We do look at the problem. That's not negative. That's acknowledging what's there. And then we ask ourselves the question, what can I do individually? What can we do in our spiritual communities to make an actual difference? One other question here. How do we use spirituality and consciousness to help people with addiction and in recovery and disease? Well, that's also my wheelhouse as well. So consciousrecovery.com, look at that. It's the same principle. And then I'm going to ask Marianne that same question. It's the same principle that we've been talking about. We must get down to the deeper root causes that are actually driving addiction. Addiction is not the problem. It is a strategy. It is a symptom of something that's happening much deeper. So Marianne, is there anything you want to add to that about how we can use spirituality and consciousness to heal any disease, including addiction?
Well, on the level of the symptom, I'm a fan of the 12-step programs, which is a spiritual program. So 12 steps are definitely taking metaphysical information and applying them specifically to the issue of addiction. But I think in terms of where all the addiction comes from, we need to recognize that we have a crisis of meaning in our society. And we have a crisis of meaning in our society because we concentrate so obsessively, and our economic system demands this, that we concentrate so much on material things at the expense of the internal life, that it's very, very difficult to find meaning there, because that's not where meaning lies. Meaning lies in our capacity to love each other. And that's why public policies that advocate for and support the ability of people to have time with their families, have a less desperate life, and all whether it has to do with paying back college loans or getting health care, anything that has to do with building community, actually ameliorates the conditions inside a person's mind and inside a person's body as well, that makes them so vulnerable to addictive tendencies. Then you have, in addition to that, things such as the opioid crisis, where we have attorneys general all over the United States now indicting big pharmaceutical company executives for their known predatory practices. So that, take something like OxyContin. There are people who really need painkillers, but we now know that big pharmaceutical executives consciously, proactively, and deliberately actually created profit centers by convincing individuals and pharmacists and even doctors that these things were not narcotic and were not addictive. So we need to address these deeper levels of meaninglessness, and this is where so much of the spiritual work comes in. And then be very, very aware of the forces in our society that would take advantage of suffering and build profit centers on them. That's evil, by the way. That's pure evil.
Yes. Thank you. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you if there's anything else you want to say to our viewers, but I'm going to take one more question. It's kind of a two-part question. Someone asks or says that they've been seeing people saying broken people are running our country. What does that focus or that paradigm create as viewing them as broken? And is it possible that wholeness might be a better way to work with it? And the second part of it is, a lot of people are experiencing anxiety right now during these times. So how can we encourage people who are experiencing anxiety to make a difference in the world, to have their own well-being spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally? And anything you want to say about either one of those two would be fantastic.
Our president is someone who said during his campaign that he could murder someone on Fifth Avenue. Remember, he said he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't be held accountable for that. And so anyone who didn't recognize that for what it is and do everything possible to keep a person who would even say that? What would even say that?
Right.
And what was the second thing that you said?
How people are experiencing a lot of anxiety right now in our culture, and how do we help people?
Okay. So we have got to stop coddling our neuroses Of course we're anxious. Of course we're traumatized. Trump is president and there's a COVID crisis. Of course we're traumatized. Okay? But we're not little broken birds. We are children of God. You know, you think the people who walked across the bridge in Selma were not traumatized? They didn't know if they were going to bring the bullets out, the dogs out, the hoses out, but they walked. The women who were suffragettes, the only thing they'd done wrong, and why should it have been wrong? They were protesting for a woman's right to vote. So what did the government do? It threw these women in prison. And the conditions in the prison were so horrible that they went on a hunger strike. And the people who ran the prison responded to that by sending men into their cells and putting these metal contraptions on their necks and force feeding them. You think they weren't anxious? You think the abolitionists weren't anxious? I mean, what is this? You think the people marching for civil rights were not? Of course we're anxious. Of course we're traumatized. But we've got to stop being so precious about it and realizing that most of us who are saying how anxious we are, our anxiety is nothing compared to the anxiety of billions of people on this planet. When you have 1 billion people on this planet who live on $1.25 a day, when you have so many millions of people in America right now as we speak, who because of the COVID, because of the ridiculously unfair and unjust bailout, which instead of giving direct cash relief has given $500 billion to big companies who are not even required then to pay their workers, those people have a right to be anxious. If we are experiencing this as the people that I believe are living in honor of our ancestors, they had reasons to be anxious too, but they rose up and they showed up. The abolitionists did, the women's suffragettes did, the people who were working in civil rights movement did. We're not the first generation to have a serious problem on our hands. And of course it makes us anxious. And of course it makes us depressed. And of course, I know I give myself an hour a day, maybe two. And then it's get up, get dressed, take a shower, and do what you can. To make it through these times, what do I say to people who are anxious? That to make it through these times, we need some emotional discipline. We need a lot of emotional discipline to do this right now. But look at what you're doing. Look at what I'm doing. Look at the chats. People want to be part in the solution. So looking at our past and our history, there were a lot of problems, like you were talking about. These things have to come up. We have to look at the shadow. We want to identify these things, but we want to identify with the problem solvers. Let other generations will look back at us. Let them not look back at us and almost pity for how weak we were at such a time as this. Let them look back at us and go, wow, wouldn't have thought it possible, but man, damn, they pulled it out. Let's just make sure that we die knowing that we did everything possible to turn this country around in time.
You don't know right now, but I'm giving you a standing ovation. So here's the standing ovation for that. Because what Marianne is saying is are you ready to hear it? I'm going to say it in a different way. We don't need to get rid of our anxiety. It's totally okay to have it, but what we do with it and how we show up is important. Create community where you can share what's happening for you, but eventually it's about that inner strength. And what we're saying is you have the power within you. You are stronger than your anxiety. I myself also just allow myself to feel whatever's there. It's a profound practice. Let myself cry. Let myself feel angry. Let myself feel joy, all of it.
Listen. We are all grieving for good reason.
Yeah.
The entire world as we knew it, nothing's going to quite be the same. Of course we're grieving. But, I used to say to people during the AIDS crisis, this is a grief support group, not a grief denial group. It's like a bruise in your body. That's what grief is. Our hearts are bruised by this. Of course we're sad. And it's a tender sadness, and we're all feeling it. But the spiritual practice, you give it to God. You give it to God. I am willing to see this differently. I am willing to see this differently. Dear God, help me be part of the solution. And also, we need to be honest with ourselves. This is rocking us to our core, but in a way that we needed to be rocked to our core.
Yes.
Americans are having our eyes opened about a lot of things. And let's just decide together we're going to be a better country on the other side of this if everybody shows up and says, God, use me.
That's it. Do you hear that, everyone? That is the greatest power that each of us has, is to recognize and honor that we are grieving. It is okay to grieve, and to also recognize that we have the inner strength to make a profound difference in our country and on our planet right now. We are not powerless. We are powerful. We have that source energy within us to actually make a difference. So let's do that. Do we have an agreement, everyone? Are we in agreement that we're ready to actually make a difference
Do I
in the
have
world?
an amen?
Yeah, yes. So Marianne, is there anything, as we move toward closing, is there anything else that you feel called to share at this moment? Anything that's coming up for you that you feel like we haven't talked about, or that you feel called to speak to?
No, I hope that people will check me out on my social media. And I hope that you and I will continue to be in these conversations. And I hope everybody will, I think you see really beautiful things right now. Look at the doctors, look at the nurses, look at the delivery people, the people picking up your garbage, the people who are working in the grocery stores. Love is all around us. Let's just keep building on that field, and we will get through this. We will. This too shall pass. And if we dig deep enough down, we're going to create the world in a much more beautiful way on the other side of it.
Absolutely. And what I want to also say in closing is love is all around us, and love is who and what we are. So let's bring that into the world. And so a huge thank you. And of course, I want to continue this conversation. You and I are partnering now with some New Thought ministers, inviting our spiritual communities to be more engaged so we can make a difference. But I, of course, would love to have part 2 of this conversation. I love you so much, Marianne.
I love you too. Great admiration for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And to invite all the great people.
Yeah, and also a huge thank you to Wholehearted Studios for producing this. Please check them out at wholehearted.org. There's some amazing things there. Of course, follow Marianne because she's so inspirational to us. So blessings to all of you right now. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
God bless you, sir.